Cubicle 7 are absolutely killing it lately with the amount of content they're putting out for Wrath and Glory so far this year, and Redacted Records is yet another cherry on top of the lore pile. From generation of loot, events, and the theme of the Space Hulk itself, this is where you'll find role tables and the advice of creating your own, which you can choose to follow to the detail, or use as a flavour, or as part of your own Space Hulk ideas. The system is simple enough to get to grips with. To generate a Space Hulk, you'll roll on a series of generation tables, starting with the origin table, which gives you the overall theme of your floating space death trap. Next, you generate if there are any inhabitants or survivors, and what their purpose is. It can range from Orc Raiders to Chaos Cultists and everything in between. The next step applies some key rooms that players can find amongst the wreckage of the Space Hulk. There's a very large variety here in this section, and it can offer a lot of narrative opportunities. The final step to the Space Hulk generation is the Hazardous Table. This gives the Space Hulk an overall hazard that harrows the player throughout. This step for me is optional. In some cases, these unique hazards could prove very thematic, but in some, it might detract from the narrative you're trying to portray. Either way, it's a nice addition. So you've now got your Space Hulk, and it's time to generate some events. There are 3 different role tables, and those are internal, external, and high tier events. These are great, but as they only come with simple description, it's going to take you a lot of background work to make them seamlessly work in a game. As an example, the first of the internal events, called Eternal Ruler, gives us no stat lines for the mummified Captain Lord of the vessel. Another good example is the 4th entry of the same role table, called Pure Poison, which provides no rules for how to apply this gas effect to the players that might get affected by it. This isn't a problem for those who come prepared, but would definitely make GMs who are applying these events on the fly a little lost for context and mechanics. Next we have the loot tables, with their own separate section themed around the origins table you rolled on beforehand. Some of the loot is nice and flavourful, and some of it has a pretty cool purpose, like coming across a Gyrinx that you can befriend and gain a boon to a casting psychic power. The next section of Redacted Records features a collection of established Space Hulks. This is where Cubicle 7 shines, because their lore and world building for these are excellent. Each Space Hulk features their own theme, background and plot hooks, and these could be used as they come or written into your own Space Hulk adventure. There are a few NPCs and enemies of note as well. This also brings me on to one of my main gripes, and that's a lack of accompanying map packs. I know I've mentioned this before, and my prayers were somewhat answered as C7 actually updated the download entries for their previous adventures, as an example the Lities of the Lost Compendium, to include player-friendly map images. But it would be so good to get some decent sized map packs for these adventures, and full colour Space Hulk maps would be an incredible addition. Luckily for me, I made the effort to purchase a couple of Warhammer battle mats that fill some of these roles, or I used my design skills to create my own for online use. But having these maps in printed format would sell really well for those lucky enough to have groups that meet physically, when it's easier and more dramatic for physical play. It's not a hobby deal breaker, more of a desire in the future. Here's where we get to the real meat of the book. There are a total of 24 new example and playable frameworks introduced in the supplement, each stemming from various factions or groups within the Gilead system, and 4 general tier based ones. These are 2 Adeptus Sororitas frameworks in detail and 4 benefits from the orders you hail from, 3 Adeptus Astra Telepathica frameworks, 2 Adeptus Mechanicus frameworks in detail and 4 benefits from the order you hail from, 2 Adeptus Ministorum frameworks, 2 Astra Militarum frameworks, 2 Inquisition frameworks, 2 Rogue Trader frameworks, 2 Scum frameworks, both in detail with a feature and danger table, and 3 Adeptus Astartes frameworks, and finally 4 tier-based frameworks in detail. I can see myself designing some pretty fun scenarios based around these frameworks. It's important to note that these are optional. You can either choose to follow one of these to the letter, or adapt one, or simply create your own using these examples as inspiration. The next section of the supplement includes details on Servitors, using them in your scenarios, their variations and corresponding stat blocks. These are great, a nice addition to the growing collection of enemy stat blocks we have access to until the inevitable bestiary gets released. There's a surprising amount of lore revolving around the different servitors in this section, and I really appreciate that. There's a bunch of plot hooks built around them as well, which is great. Next is a list of new and available talents. Interestingly, the talents header references A to I, and while this is certainly correct, as the Redacted Records supplement is one of many, I can't help but feel like I would have preferred the full list, even if we had to wait for a future or separate book. Some of these talents are ridiculously cheap, and some of them are bonkers good. Few players creating characters will want to overlook these new entries. Take Blademaster for example. For only 10 XP cost, you're gaining your rank in defense, and at rank 3 this is a lot of defense for 10 XP. The Assault and Devastator Doctrines are essentially a talent and an ascension package rolled into one for Adeptus Astartes characters. It's super cool and it's pretty cost effective. The final section focuses on the lore of the Gilead system. This is what I consider an expansion on what the Forsaken System Player's Guide started, and it's by far the most interesting section of the book for world building and narrative. Here you'll find samples of various cults from the 2 planets of Avacarus and Nethrius. A shame that it stops only at these 2 planets, but I'll take it. I look forward to hearing about the others in due time. This section of the book is amazing. There are a ton of lore entries with accompanying plot hooks and information that will inspire you to create scenarios of your own, or you can simply use theirs. There's also a bunch of associated stat blocks for cultists and enemies associated with a specific cult or plot hook as well. To wrap up, Redacted Records is a brilliant addition to the lore of the Gilead system and offers some unique mechanics to help you create a Space Hulk on the fly. More importantly, offers some very strong and new talents for players. So, a couple of minor downsides. The very first version that was released digitally had a few hiccups, though I believe they're now mostly been addressed and updated. The talents A to I section threw me off. Not sure if I like that. I prefer to have everything concise as possible rather than specifically breaking up entries where it can be helped. The same can be said about only having cult entries for Avacarus and Nithrius. I would have loved to have had the entries for the other planets in the system too, or would have preferred them all to be collated together in a separate future book. Still, their addition is a welcome surprise, and their entries are well written and have given me a ton of narrative ideas already. Would I recommend this book? Of course I would. The lore is well written, the artwork is absolutely stunning, and there's a lot of inspiration ideas to take from the book. The Servitor entries are a nice touch, and the players will love the new talents, some of which I can see being favourites. As always, this is a must-have on any self-respecting GM's shelves, even if they only reference it for the talents, lore, servitors and frameworks and don't plan on using it for the Space Hulk generation mechanics.